So I'm just going to jump right in. I work at Save the Bay we focus on Narragansett Bay and its watershed and the south coast of Rhode Island, but I've had the opportunity to work with other partners around New England and down on Long Island Sound. Some of the salt marsh migration strategies we've employed over the last decade or so. We've been conducting activities to improve the condition of the migration area, or Grant mentioned the upland retreat area, by simply something as simple as moving mow lines inland. This is a marsh along the Narrow River where the town was literally mowing into the Spartina altiniflora, and we slowly with them moved this mow line inland, which today is a combination of IVA species as well as some upland species. We've removed obstructions to migration, such as a stone wall on a Mass Audubon property on Allen's Pond on the south coast. Removing a head of tide dam. This was a former water supply, and now the dam's removed and tidal flow is allowing for that natural tidal regime to be restored. And removing of any obstruction from this is a bike path to low-lying roadways. And I didn't include this until a moment ago when Bart mentioned some of the sediment placement projects that we've been doing in Rhode Island. I was considering those more salt marsh restoration technique, but as Bart mentioned, we have included different elevations in those elevation enhancement projects. So some of the elevations are higher, which create area for future migration, as well as other habitat types for horseshoe crab spawning, shorebird nesting, etc. And a common thread to all of these projects is we are looking at restoring the hydrology of the marsh, as well as trying to protect that migration corridor, working with other restoration partners. I brought this slide up simply as an important tool. I know some states use MyCoast. It's a great app to document king tides. And since we're working with the reserves, I think it's an important tool to engage the community in identifying migration corridors through king tide monitoring, as this image shows. Many projects require buy-in from community partners to change a land use practice, and it's important for those partners to witness or have an imagery of tidal flooding of these areas where marshes either have or will migrate in the future. And this is a former ball field. The backstop actually has Iva and Solidago growing along it, and the outfield is Distichus and mosquito breeding habitat. So clearly we're having to work with communities to change land use practices, which is a hurdle and an obstacle in and of itself. At Sepauwett Marsh, I'm going to talk about Sepauwett Marsh and another marsh called the Soames Preserve. This is in Tiverton, Rhode Island. It's one of the few areas with significant open space. And again, we're in Rhode Island, so everything's small. The scale is much different. With significant space for that marsh to migrate inland. You can see the marsh in green. We've had two SLAM mapping efforts in the last decade. The first looked at 1, 3, and 5 foot scenarios. That was done by TNC. The second, done by URI, which is this image, went up to 8.8 feet of sea level. Here you can see 2 state-owned parcels along the marsh, as well as along a cobble beach. And here's an image, a close-up image of those 2 parcels. And these, again, state-owned. They had been in agricultural activities. The state had 2 active leases, agricultural leases on them, and they were farmed in potatoes to the west of this road and in squash to the east. In 2016, we were able to work with the state in starting to change the land use practice. Also, Along the marsh itself, there was a cobble or stone berm from just the clearing of the fields over the years, and that berm was impounding fresh water and acting as an impediment to marsh migration. Um, this image shows this western field with, you can see the till lines in the foreground and the beginnings of some salt tolerant species like solidago. And here, this is the eastern field with juncus and iva beginning to migrate into the low-lying sections of the field. So working with our Department of Environmental Management, the owners of these parcels, when those ag leases expired, we first converted this the field to the west, about 10 acres to warm season grasses. We also were working with them on an adaptation project. I don't know if you could see my cursor, the parking lot used to be out on this little upland and people had to drive across the cobble beach to access it. So we were able to get funding to move the parking lot inland. You could see up here along this roadway and put boulders out so people couldn't drive on the cobble beach. On the east side, we worked on removing the cobbles and that was a pretty simple activity. We didn't remove the whole thing, just the areas where it was impounding water, and we planted that area. It's about a 12-acre field with warm season grasses. Within the marsh itself, we worked on a hydrology restoration project. There's this large mega pool that is pretty deep, and it's been on the platform for since at least the 1939 aerial imagery. We didn't see the mega pool itself shrink, but we did see a conversion. We installed drainage features to drain this pool and drain some of that fresh water and impounded water around the mega pool. And we saw an increase of both Disticlus and Patens in the area around the mega pool. So again, we're looking at restoring the hydrology of the marsh as well as that migration corridor. So that's Sepauwett. Over to the Palmer River. This is one of our few tidal estuaries that hasn't been dammed, and it's fresh tidal for a significant ways. Again, significant for Rhode Island, is not on the same scale as Delaware. But we've been focusing on this area for a number of years for land protection, since there is still some space for marsh migration into undeveloped low-lying areas, that a lot of those areas are still in agriculture. You can see on the west side, a very developed watershed. And so we've been working with the town of Warren in the Warren Land Trust and Natural Resources Conservation Service to try to do land protection in this area. And with Natural Resources Conservation Service, we find it's a pretty effective tool in Rhode Island. The Wetland Reserve Easement Program can be used for protecting salt marshes and their migration corridor. So the key thing is it can protect those associated uplands, I think, so to prevent those areas from being developed. And you'll see some development activity right up along the marsh in the future photos here. So other NRCS tools, the Agricultural Land Easement Program, Farm and Ranch Lands Protection Program. And even for those lands that have been protected, we've used in the Environmental Quality Incentive Program to manage invasives. So at this site, we worked with the NRCS to secure a wetland reserve easement. Took about 4 years, and then we were able to, the wetland reserve easement program will fund the restoration component that we've been working on since 2021. This is a close-up of that parcel. You can see The marsh to the west in green, that olive color is about 2.8 feet of sea level rise. And this is that same storm event that Grant mentioned in 23, 24, where it was probably about over 2 feet of sea level rise. And you can see this lower section of the field flooded. So this marsh, just like so many of our marshes, has had significant agricultural activities. They still are found on the landscape and still impact hydrology. Here you can see impounded water behind an agricultural feature, an embankment, as well as stone walls, creating mosquito breeding habitat and causing marsh vegetation die-off. The
Wenley, we're
hydrology,
going to have you wrap up in a minute. That's
okay,
okay.
okay, thanks.
Thank you.
The hydrology restoration plan here is shows ditches we maintained as well as shallow drainage features that tie into the some of the drainage network in the fields you can see in blue. And then in the migration corridor, we worked on invasive plant management in those areas in brown, as well as planting native grasses and pollinator species. In that lower migration corridor, there was an invasive willow that we were originally going to replant the area after those willows were removed, but decided, due to that shading issue that Grant mentioned, to just allow it to be restored as a meadow habitat for future marsh migration. And that's where my colleague Ben Gaspar is working with Kenny Raposa, that Corey mentioned, on ecotone monitoring at this site as well as many other sites around Rhode Island to monitor the vegetation community over time. And that's all I have. Thank you.